I remember being told, someone said, if you called the book Failure and it won a prize, then maybe you should call another book It Just Gets Worse. So instead, I took the advice and I called it Luxury. Well, Ellis just gave me an idea. I wasn't sure of the first. I'm going to read some of the small poems in this collection, and then I'm going to read from the longer poem, which is half the book. And now I know which poem to begin with, IGA. It's 1 week after Sandy, and Mrs. Cobb, our mailman's aunt, who lived in the Halloween house on Sherrill Road that burned down, is ahead of me in line, hands in her hair, screaming. Betsy, the cashier, is telling the assistant manager, Peggy, that all she did was say her peaches aren't the ones on sale. Mr. Brim, the sourpuss who owns the pizzeria on North Main, yells from behind me, "Just give her the damn peaches. A dead deer's on my garage. My backyard's a lake. We're still at my sister-in-law's, and I'm not hollering my head off." I offer the pay, and Betsy snorts, "You?" Because 2 years ago I refused to make a third donation to her Baptist choir, and her God isn't the forgiving kind. Now, Rudy, the manager, is here, angry not to be among his friends, the chips and donuts in aisle 6. "Good," Mr. Brim groans. "Now everyone's here." Actually, almost everyone is here. JJ, the deli air drummer, who hums R&B and slices everything thin. Fergus, the cart gatherer, whose tattoos depict angry biblical patriarchs, and Benny in produce, who lost 84 pounds eating sardines and Cocoa Puffs and has iPhone photos to prove it. All come to see if this is another catastrophe that will keep us up all night, watching our kids sleep in the living room, praying for the wind to stop, the roof to hold, that last insurance bill got paid, fearing our ignorance and pettiness is to blame, that if we were just a little more humble in the hearing and sublime in the doing, as St. Augustine suggested, we could all go back to sleep only one donation and the right peach shy of deliverance. At the Manhattan Social Security Office. The mind seeks what is dead, for what is living escapes it. Miguel de Unamuno. I'm practicing the Stoic art of insouciance, not because I prefer not thinking about what signing up for Medicare means, or why so many who came after me are being called first, but because downstairs my soul was examined for signs of violence and duplicity. Its fatigue and ambivalence weren't visible, apparently. In the next row, a man is telling a girl bobbing to an iPhone to sit still before the guard returns. When I was her age, signing up meant going to Vietnam, which meant practicing the Zen art of vanishing. At the windows, a blind man is asking why he didn't receive his disability payments in prison. He needs his sustenance. Behind me, another man is asking to see my paper. He's looking for work, he says. Happy to be free of Afghanistan, what could work? I hand him my New York Review of Books. Bismarck said explaining was a weakness. As her father explains the necessity of securing her future, the girl squirms. She fears only boredom. I feared everything. In 5 months, father would die, and mother and I would live on the $200 a month his Social Security paid. At the windows, the blind man is practicing the existential art of groveling, exposing the stitches on his scalp to a clerk who's practicing the cynical art of indifference. The girl's soul, hovering near the ceiling, is enjoying its moment of radiance. My soul, fretfully pacing the water cooler, is practicing the fatalistic art of understanding that nothing can be done about Afghanistan, that in order to influence the future, we must kill it. Greed. We live in East Hampton, and in the winter, our street is absolutely deserted, and this was written right after the Great Recession, or during it, actually, when the street was particularly deserted, in winter especially. My ocean town struggles to pick up leaves, offer summer school, and keep our library open. Every day now, more men stand at the railroad station, waiting to be chosen for work. Because it's thought the Hispanics will work for less, they get picked first, while the whites and blacks avoid each other's eyes. Our handyman, Santos, who expects only what his hands earn, is proud of his half-acre in Guatemala, where he plans to retire. His desire to proceed with dignity is admirable, but he knows that now no one retires. Everyone works harder. My father imagined a life more satisfying than the one he managed to lead. He didn't see himself as uneducated, thwarted, or bitter, but soon to be rich. Being rich was his right, he believed. Happiness, I used to think, was a necessary illusion. Now I think it's just precious moments of relief, like dreams of Guatemala. Sometimes at night in winter, surrounded by the significant silence of empty mansions, which once were cottages where people lived their lives, and now are owned by banks and the absent rich, I like to stand at my window looking for a TV's futile flickering, always surprised to see, instead, the quaint, porous face of my reflection, immersed in darkness, its one abundance. How I became a teacher. I'm a little nervous about reading this and with having a room full of students, or maybe ex-students, I don't know. How I became a teacher. She sat there quietly across the kitchen table playing solitaire, each sighing breath rising and falling, the green shine of her eyes turning opaque, each descent of her shoulders lowering me, her left shoe tapping a tune I never recognized. Not once did I interrupt, ask for something the way Father always did. I sat across the snowy world, slowly mastering the art of disappearing into someone else. Let me take some. It's great fun being watched drinking water, as certain people have made it known. The Kiss, for Jack Shiglick and Manuel Fernandez Castellero. In a sense, Jack and Manuel were starting over again. Jack, a Romanian Jew who designed our house, drank our kids' concoctions, made out of everything on a restaurant's table, which we wouldn't do, and Manuel, who shared his amazement at a perplexing world while surviving Cuba, communism, and AIDS, got married at City Hall not long after two men could. To help them celebrate, Monica and I brought a fancy bottle of champagne we could never find a reason to open before. As is the custom, we kissed after my toast while they just looked at each other, curiously. Never in public before, Jack said. Okay, I know what it feels like to see myself through the harsh light of another's eyes, to be the other. Suddenly, we were they and they us, if you know what I mean. I mean, objectified. Relax, there's no point to be made. Even notarized, love is never normal or wise, and no one knows how to behave or hasn't felt despised. It doesn't matter that my toast was celebratory, that I'm saying now what I couldn't say then. What matters is they kissed finally, quite elegantly, and we all enjoyed the splendid dinner Jack made. Cakes. Some of these I have never read before. I mean, out loud. I mean, in front of people. And my dog Penelope would be highly insulted. But she's not a people. This is one of the cakes that my wife makes. So I'm just, in case, okay. Cakes. I have learned a few things. My wife makes porcelain sculptures of cakes, each the size of an actual cake. Delicious monuments to every occasion, if edible only by the imagination. On each, an object, a bird, feathers, stones, teeth, or piles of tiny primeval people, struggling, it seems, either to be more defined or less conspicuous. One, a slice with a single tiny figure balancing itself awkwardly on top, mystified by its absolute aloneness, wondering what happened to all the others. Sometimes I watch her standing there, arms akimbo, staring at her theater of absurd desserts, crowding the table in the living room, thinking perhaps of the uncelebrated child hidden inside the wife and mother, inside the artist, each surprised, if not delighted, at what was made out of nothing but faith, that what lies hidden in each birthday and anniversary can be grasped, cherished, and eaten. The Woman's March. So many mothers are here, daughters and granddaughters. Mine's been dead for 19 years, but somehow managed to come. I'm seeing her everywhere, in the pleased with itself smile of the little girl riding her father's shoulders, holding a sign announcing girl power and the beginning of the woman's century. In the don't mess with me look of the much-pierced young woman in black who appears to have finally found her cadence. In the excited green-gray eyes of the old woman in a wheelchair being pushed along at quite a clip by, I assume, her grandson, who looks absolutely mesmerized. And just ahead is the forceful stride of the black drummer banging away for all she is and wants to be, using everything she has to make a point about strength and willfulness and sacrifice that maybe only women have the right to make, having made all of us, shared themselves so completely. A point about going too far and not far enough, about time and the pain it brings. And yes, here I am, older than I ever intended to be, enjoying the ringing in my ears, remembering being lifted into the air by my mother, trembling with joy as she enfolded me into the hospitable wings of her peasant apron. Yes, she's here, marching with all the others, all of whom understand what's being asked of them. One more time. I'll read one more of the small ones, Googling ourselves. You think yourself wise, proud Zarathustra. Then guess the riddle. Speak then. Who am I? By Nietzsche. These strangers with my name busy being kidnapped, embezzled, honored, and dying at a frightening rate. The cross-dressing exterminator convicted of rape in Kensington, Ohio, sentenced to 72 years without bail. The policeman killed stopping a burglary in Thermopolis, Wyoming. Could they have imagined the Florida painter with their name communicating with extraterrestrials through sculptures made out of railroad tracks, or being written about in a poem by another member of their redundant family for a reason none of us can explain? Sometimes I fear I'm imaginary, don't really exist. Catch myself wondering why I only seem to like myself when, say, I'm wearing a teacher's face, because I see myself only through others' eyes. In that case, who am I really? Alone at night watching a ball game, I'm always surprised when I speak to myself in third person, wondering why this man cares so much about something he plays no part in. It's easier to wonder why Nietzsche sought his soul's sympathy, a truth he knew he despised, probably feared he wouldn't survive, to imagine him up late seeking his ever-evolving, unidentifiable self, a past more inhabitable and less unforgiving, anxious to know why someone with his name would say, "Poets lie too much. Who among us has not adulterated his wine?" Late at night, the web is a dangerous swamp of voyeuristic self-scrutiny and addictive impersonation, the ego testifying for and against itself, seeking evidence of triumph and complicity, sanctioned without malice, pretense, or God. Who is this man obsessively looking up all his persona narrators, feeling like a hodgepodge, trapped somewhere between heaven and earth, spitting against the wind? Is it because he knows he's getting closer to the end, will soon vanish and become nothing? Is this why he's studying everyone who answers to his name, because one may have invented time or sympathy or God and will love him even momentarily for who he is? I'm going to read a few sections of the longer poem. It's 40 pages. I'm not going to read the whole. A few sections. 1. Sometimes a hidden memory or thought flings my right arm forward, and I'll recoil as if struck by an invisible blow and cry out. It's over in a moment, but the cry, elemental, fearful, and contrite, lingers like a scent of decay. That's when all that is yet to happen is erased by what already has. And let me say, I should say that luxury starts with a quote from Camus. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. All the rest comes afterwards. The poem deals with 4 characters, all of whom killed themselves, one of them being my father, or at least in my 17-year-old mind, that was the case. Saturday nights, and R was a friend of mine he was a brilliant poet and jazz pianist who killed himself when he was 27. Saturday nights, I went to hear R spin infinite spools of biblical jazz prophecy out of a miserable bar piano in our college town, the kind that makes the floor weep and the ceiling grieve. R believed his pain was supreme, that he was king, being the son of a white mom and the black man she cheated on her white husband with, given his slave papers and set adrift at 8 in foster homes because, she explained, he was too much of one thing and not enough of another. Thus he became an orphan, stillborn, obsessed with white women, the kind who came to hear him use his genius to hate himself and hate them. Up there, deep inside each sullen puff of a cigarette, his inner voice up-tempo, dot-time scale riff coming from so far down. The only question left was how much longer pain would sustain him. He could live on nothing. This Christmas, a 70th birthday present, my wife and two sons took me to Finca La Viaga, Hemingway's house in San Francisco de Paula, Cuba, where I, among tourists from Canada, China, and Sweden, was utterly happy. Passing through fragile windows at roped-off furniture, belligerent trophy heads, decaying books and photos of matadors and movie actors, a ghostly royal portable typewriter, all the vexed memorabilia of death's foremost connoisseur. Yes, Hemingway, whose stories I read while Dad was dying, about fathers and sons, codes of honor and courage and gracious appetites. The kind of stories I wanted to write, with luminous sentences unafraid to embrace the simplicity of grief and disgrace. Hemingway, who, like my father and R, chose death, would show me how to live. In section 2, it starts with a quote from Hemingway. He was too simple to ponder he was too simple to wonder when he had attained humility, the old man in the sea. Sometimes a noise I can sense but not hear ricochets in a place in me I can't name. That's when the darkness accentuates all my feelings of guilt and shame, and I'm unable to distinguish between misery and nothingness, when all dignity vanishes and nothing is left to say or do, be curious about or desire, when my mother's voice pleads for me to remember everything I live for. Three, starts with a quote from Paul Celan. O one, O none, O no one, O you. Where did the way lead when it led nowhere? Sometimes when something I fear cannot tolerate something I desire, I'll wince and shudder and shout out. As if confronted with an idea or thought or feeling I cannot accept. Then, at the center of a pause I never felt before, a voice will remind me of things I do poorly, mistakes I cannot forgive. Sometimes, unable to breathe or feel my hands or feet, a void inside me slowly fills with the sobriety and brilliance of shame. This is when a black bird perches on my shoulder, asking me to stop thinking, stop talking and dreaming, to stop, simply just stop. I fear I missed a section that I would have explained that section, but it's too late. The turtle crossing Old Stone Highway this morning may not yet have arrived at its destination, should one exist. Perhaps one shouldn't interfere with the struggles of a species not his own. Sisyphus's dilemma was human, after all. Sympathy is ancient and often hopeless, and enterprise as instinct and desire. Out here in spring, a high frequency of wings, the dissonance of unbridled wind, the endless walking and running along winding roads and blind curves, the wild, uninhibited willfulness of anxious new life. Yesterday, a man riding his bike was killed when a deer hit by a pickup flew into him from across the road. Bad luck, Murphy's Law, or a logic so perverse as to be absurd. Perhaps they shared, this man and dear, a love of fields of tall grass, cul-de-sacs and back roads leading nowhere, a belief in family, loyalty, and the common good, loved the dusk equally. Once in 1986, in late spring, one of Hemingway's granddaughters called to ask if I was the poet who had written about her father's house in Key West. I said yes, and she asked if my father had also killed himself. The poem seemed to say so. Her voice, sunken and forlorn, sounded weary of speaking intimately to strangers. Yes, I said, essentially. He was tired of suffering the illusion of success, the sorrow of impotence. Well, she asked, was I also obsessed with the idea of suicide? I tried hard not to be, I said, and we both laughed. She was a painter, she said, and a few other things, but mostly a Hemingway. Did I know what I wanted from her grandfather? Once, I said, I believed it was rhapsody, the art of self-invention, turning anger and despair into music, speaking simply and truthfully. Now, I said, I understood it was something more private and essential, permission to live. This is the last section. Now, from across the house, the booming voice of my 16-year-old son announces his belief in the law and right of succession, the beginning of his reign. Already too big for this house, it conspires with a future that is his alone. My wife, a sculptor, looks up from her porcelain cakes arrayed over the living room table, which, even with the dead birds and beetles and tiny people writhing on top, are festive enough. While I, standing in the kitchen, pondering questions about guilt, satisfaction, and lunch, remember leaning against the sycamore in our front yard 26 years ago, trying to imagine a family inside the house I just bought. A future prolific enough to contain squawking black birds, flying deer, and a notion as mysterious and improbable, as fragrant and luxurious as happiness. Thank you.
That was sort of the perfect length, leaving you wanting more, wasn't it? Really, really great. So many people over the years have wanted to and have published books by Philip Schultz that I sometimes find myself wondering, is Deb Garrison at Knopf his editor now, or his beloved friend, Dranka Willen? Well, this time it is Jill Bialosky of W.W. Norton, whom the Poetry Society of America honored a few years ago for her great contribution to the publishing of American poetry. She's published in her some 40 years more than 100 poets. And I am so sorry that she has the flu and is not able to be here to pose to Phil the questions which she composed. But I'm delighted to step in, though as I am an ardent reader of Phil's poems, I certainly would have chosen IGA in my years at the New Yorker. It's perfect. And an admirer of his memoir, My Dyslexia, and count him a dear personal friend, too. So I'm going to start with questions of Jill's, and I'd be very glad, that's why I'm standing, actually, to alternate Jill's questions with yours, or I'll barrel ahead with hers and keep looking up. And if you want to ask a question, hi, Grace, or say something, please raise your hand. But before we start, I just want to say one thing quickly, because I read this book just today, and It's really a wonderful book. And I think listening to Phil, you're such a good reader too, I was reminded of the title of my class this semester at Columbia, The Beauty and Power of the Sentence in Prose and Poetry. His sentences are so limpid and natural, and it's like brook water over stones or something. And his wit just rises very gently to the surface. So I thought of an essay that Howard Moss, my predecessor at The New Yorker, wrote about Elizabeth Bishop and called All Praise. So I'm going to ask Jill's questions now. Next to Failure, your Pulitzer Prize-winning collection of 2008, the title of this new collection has somewhat of an ironic ring. Are the two collections in conversation with each other, and if so, in what ways?
Well,
here, wait.
And, okay, this is working. I didn't plan it that way. I mean, I think it wanted to be called luxury because the word kept coming up in the poem, and originally I thought of the poem as being a book by itself. And I couldn't fight that. I mean, there is this luxury of life out. It's so beautiful in East Hampton, the ocean and the light, that to be able to enjoy it is such a luxury that I didn't see that. I didn't wish I could plead being sophisticated enough to see an irony between the two, but I didn't.
Well, you have a lot of things to say about that are pretty amazing about suicide in the poem, and you describe, I think, Paul Celan's, or is it your own sense of the sobriety and brilliance of shame? So there is a kind of luxury to that feeling too, that puts it naturally in relation to the other impulse.
The thing I think of is the 5 stories up, the Elizabeth Bishop poem, where she's upstairs, and I know that apartment, and the little dog is allowed to go and do something to flowers, and the owner says, "You should be ashamed." No, have you no shame?
Have you no shame?
And she's wondering about since dogs have no sense of shame, and how she dealt with. It's much easier for me to talk about her shame than my own, and I guess that's where I'm going.
Yeah.
But dealing with it and realizing that this is something, a force in myself that I'm up against, and in people I work with and people I know and in work I like, that there's a scale that we consciously and unconsciously constantly are putting weights on, and when the fear or shame gets too large, it takes over, and we have to, with desire and ambition and love of something, try to balance it out, or we don't continue. That it's a constant act of balancing, and in luxury certainly is an ability to see the right side of the scale. Because shame by itself is quite a force that we work against.
You're just making me think of a favorite translation of Berwin's of an Ossip Mandelstam poem that ends, "So I say to the pans in the balance, rise up and walk." That's a wonderful metaphor. Okay, here's Jill. The title poem of the collection, Luxury, is quite intimate. You mentioned once that The Wherewithal, your 2014 novel in verse, gave you the will to deal with the subject of suicide and luxury. You've already done that, I think. Except here. How did writing The Wherewithal change you as a poet, and how is luxury a reflection of that growth?
I have no idea why I decided to spend all those years taking on the Holocaust and the welfare system. One didn't seem enough, so I took on the other.
Now you're taking on Social Security offices.
Right. And it was hard to tolerate living. It's a kind of living in hell and writing about it. And then I discovered that having done it, I had built up this resistance, so why not deal then? It was a dry run, a rehearsal for dealing with suicide. And it gave me, if I could do one, I could do the other. The idea of suicide was a subject that was waiting for me my entire life, whether I knew it or not. I didn't know it, and I seemed to be happy enough and settled enough to be able to take it on.
That's good. That wonderful. Monica's just going like this. That's the wonderful moment when your mother enters the poem and says, "Stop."
Yeah.
Or or think of the things that are good. Think of the goodness of your life.
What you live for.
Kind of summons up for me, although I only read it at 2:00 today, the words at the graveside of your father, when in your poem you say, there's the rabbi repeating things God said when no one was listening. Really, really great. Does anyone have a question? Shall I keep going with Jill's questions? Luxury uses a few central characters, your father, Hemingway, Paul Celan, a poet called R, to explore the question of suicide, which, as your epigraph reminds us, Camus called the only serious philosophical question. How did this chorus of voices come together? Each section of the poem opens with an epigraph as well. How's the poem in dialogue with each of its characters and with its various settings from East Hampton to Cuba?
I'm not sure I understood that question.
How is the poem in dialogue with each of its characters? And I would say that might be because you're going back and forth quite a bit between joy and panic. And in fact, there's an invocation of Nietzsche, and the lines are the mad, delicate, or divine things that transfigure pain. So I think that that's something of what you're capturing so well.
Is the question how I got those four characters? How
and how you put it together, how you got them to...
Well, I knew my family took me to Cuba, and I loved seeing Hemingway's house, and I was transfixed. And I came back and I decided to write about that, and that it's impossible to write about my father without writing about Hemingway, because that's when I wanted to be a writer. And in writing about that took me to my friend R, because another suicide. And then I realized I was one character short, and I couldn't find the other one, and no, one suicide short. And see, the humor does help. It's how you survive. And I was on the beach with my dog, and I realized that it was Paul Celan, and I didn't know why. And then I remembered that my first day in Iowa as a student, there was up on the stage a young poet named Ralph Dickey, who had just published a beautiful translation of Paul Celan's Death Fugue, his most famous poem, in a very fancy, prestigious magazine called Daedalus. And the director and everyone was very proud of him. And I thought, wow. And so that was my introduction to Paul Celan. When we became friends, he introduced me to all these Jewish poets, none of whom I knew, like Mandelstam and Yehuda Amichai. And it was interesting. He kind of wanted to be, a Jewish intellectual in a way. And so we became friends. Because so that's how all the four characters determined one another in the poem.
I love your response to Hemingway's granddaughter, that you were drawn to the rhapsody of kind of transfigured sorrow. Here's another question about luxury. Let's see. That has to do with, ultimately, luxury is a very personal, even private poem. How do you balance this intimacy with approaching suicide as a philosophical problem? Well, clearly you've read a lot about it, and you've taken refuge in writing about it, right?
Well, poetry, like philosophy, gives you perspective and distance, and allows you to look at yourself or your subject up on a stage with some distance and some ability to appreciate it. And it also puts the pain to the side. And suddenly it's a subject for a poem. And the joy and ecstasy sometimes in writing and trying to find the music allows you to deal with the darkest and most difficult subjects. Look at Pollock. I mean, that's why incredible, all that energy and ecstasy. And, look how he suffered. And he turned all that into beauty and satisfaction.
Yeah. I was amazed at the Pollock drawings at the Morgan. They were very surprising. Did anyone notice those at that recent great show of drawings? But can you handle one more question about luxury? Okay. Sure. Toward the end of the poem, the narrator is, quote, standing in the kitchen, pondering questions about guilt, satisfaction, and lunch. These lines seem characteristic of the collection as a whole, which finds moments of deep reflection in everyday experiences. Is this something you thought about in crafting the collection? And how do the shorter poems that precede luxury work in tandem with the long poem at the heart of the collection? Well, the short poems in the beginning introduce us to lots of aspects of your happy and sometimes panicked life, right? And then you go into the aria.
It's just introducing, I guess, the persona, the speaker of the long poem, and in a less hectic, less stressed way, just different aspects of his life, I guess.
I'm taking down these answers so I can tell them to Jill.
Which is that I'm so moved tonight hearing you read and realizing what I'm sure everybody here has already realized and understands, but the marriage of your poems in luxury and Monica's sculptures, her confections with the writhing bodies and the dead birds on top, feel just sublime. That's all.
That is so great. That was Jill's last question. How are you affected? How are you affected by Monica's art? And you have answered it with sublimity.
Well, I knew immediately that the cover, the only explanation, the best explanation I could give for what I mean by luxury was one of Monica's cakes, because the absurdity, the irony, a symbol of celebration is got these life things, difficult things on top, which seems fitting. Yeah, a marriage. That's a very good way, Leslie, of putting it. It's a marriage.
Anyone else? So this is Jill, too. Aging seems, I wasn't going to go into this, but it seems like you're so eloquent. Why not ask these questions? Aging seems a central theme in the collection. In the opening poem, Paraphernalia, you remark that the present is something, quote, you seem to have less to do with lately. And also write of your, quote, hurry to be obsolete. So do you think your role as a poet has changed as you've gotten older? And how has aging changed your poetry?
I don't know. I understand that it comes up, and I look at it. I guess if I couldn't have written this poem and dealt with this subject earlier.
Yeah.
I kind of made peace with it. I never really was aware before. You know, I always saw my father as working himself to death, but then I understood that in the eyes of the 17-year-old, he was killed himself. He wanted to die, and I never could deal with that before. And I would obliquely deal. It would come up in a poem, but I never was ready to take it on. I guess it suddenly wasn't all that frightening. I guess. Mm-hmm. you make some kind of deal with your mortality, and so that a subject like that didn't scare me that much or as much. It was more approachable because it was a way of talking about all the things I love, all the things that seem precious to me. Ironically.
Do you think that kind of throwing in the towel was the seductiveness for your father, or do you think it was a more conscious suicide?
Well, I mean, just specifically, his doctor outrageously asked the 17-year-old into his office and said that your father had a stroke. He's probably going to die soon unless he stops working. He won't listen to me or your mother. It's up to you to save him. So I took that on, and it became violent arguments, and I had to help him. But so I was asking him constantly, why do you want to die? Why, you know? So in my mind, it was suicide, and there was this idea of suicide. Now, I also became obsessed with Hemingway, who 6 months, 7 months before had killed himself. So I was set for life.
Yeah.
The path was, the lights came on and the path was shown to me.
And anybody
I can't
else
believe I was terrified of doing all of this. And now, well, I don't know what.
Anybody else here? So there's one more question here, because the paean to Monica Banks has been expressed with the word sublime. Thank you so much. A couple of the poems seemed more political than others. At the Manhattan Social Security Office and the Women's March were on the eve of another one, right? For example, though there is a persistent anxiety for the future that your sons will help make, the collection overall strikes, this is Jill, although I agree, strikes me as quite hopeful. How has the turbulence of our political moment impacted your writing?
Well, I feel that speaking out, whether it's poetry, and whether you directly or indirectly dealing with it, is more essential and necessary than ever. And usually what process I have to go through, I mean, I can spend 10 years on a poem and 300 drafts often, that it seems like necessary now in a way that maybe I didn't always feel. I mean, I'm a product of the 60s and protests and all of that, but this feels, well, I have 2 sons who are entering the world in the future, and my own relationship with the future is tenuous, but, you know, it's theirs, and one does have to fight for it. The Cretans shouldn't really take over.
Well, after this wonderful gift of your reading and the book, and of course Phil's ready to sign books, mine too, I hope. So I just want to remind everybody that there is another major gift of poetry it's fairly recent, and that is Jenny Holzer's AIDS Memorial in the West Village, where Monica and Phil and my partner and I all live. And it's at 12th Street across from the old St. Vincent's, and nearly the entire Song of Myself has been reproduced, carved, letter by letter. And it's like that game of, is it some sort of Bible game where you open it and it seems to explain the whole day? You know, with my dog, I'll walk past and read a phrase like, the nearest gnat is an explanation. And I think, how did he turn that into poetry? It's crazy. And then for the rest of the day, it seems to explain everything. And that's Whitman, isn't it? I mean, you just don't know how he does it. It's the power of his sensibility or something. But anyhow, it's the gift of poetry. And thank you so much. And thank you. You've been a great audience.